Hello and welcome back to the Go-Karts and Good Times YouTube channel. Today I'm finally going to be fixing some nagging issues that have bothered me since I got the car and adding a fun goodie to make the car look better. The car is dirty again, but you may have seen from the last clip, I did get something new installed on the car. The main focus of this video, however, is fixing the bad wheel bearing on my rear driver's side wheel and the CV axle on the front passenger side. The CV axle isn't making any noise or vibration, but it does have a torn boot and it doesn't look to be in the best of condition, and it's something I'd rather do now rather than later. I am back filming on my phone because I'm kind of in a time crunch and I could use the simplicity, so I'm going to get right into things. First, I'm obviously going to start by getting the rear of the car jacked up and getting this wheel off. To actually get to the wheel bearing, I'll have to remove the brakes and that big fat nut on the end of the axle. The nut on the end of the axle that has to be removed to slide the hub assembly off of the end of the axle is a little bit more gnarly than we had originally anticipated, so I've scraped off as much of the loose rust as I can, and I've now got it soaking with some kind of penetrating oil. It's only WD-40 because I don't have anything else on hand, but this should at least help get it off. I've called in some help, and he's going to heat and work on that nut while I move on to replacing the front passenger CV shaft. Like the other side, I've got to get the car jacked up and the wheel off, but I'm going to be using a little bit of magic for this one. And now I can work on getting the nut off on this side, which looks way better than the rear driver's side. This has a little metal tab that has to be bent out, which secures the nut in place, which over there is completely rusted and destroyed. With the brakes and the nut on the end of the axle removed, now I can move on to removing the nut that sits on the ball joint holding the knuckle in place so that I can swing it out of the way and hopefully slide the axle out. My phone died, but as you can see, we got the stud on the ball joint disconnected from the lower control arm, which means we can now pop the CV axle off of the transmission and slide it out from the side. Unfortunately, both ends of our cotter pin that holds the castle nut on the stud broke off, so that there's still some of the pin inside there that we have to drill out, but this shouldn't be too hard to tackle. You should be able to see the axle down there with the torn boot, and where I have this fork between the transmission and its end, popping it just slightly out so it can be slid out the side. After you pop it, it's just a little slide to pull the old one out, and then the new one can be slid right back in where the old one was removed. As is apparent on the old one, there's this little ring that has to be snapped into the transmission that just takes a couple of firm shoves. As you can see, it's completely flush from the top, and from the side here everything looks good. So now it can just be shoved back together and reassembled like it was taken apart, but backwards. Axle in and ball joint on. Now we're going to look up the torque spec for the axle nut before getting everything back together. With the first of two objectives complete, I can now get the wheel back on and tidy up this area before dealing with that nasty nut in the back. With all the lug nuts snug, I can let the car down, torque them to spec, and then move on to the nightmare side. Moving on, in the background, after heating and oiling up this gnarly nut, I think we can finally make a pass at putting that big socket on and using the impact to spin it off. Trying to get deep enough so that we can access the bearing. We're just peeling away layers, and the next layer to peel away is the e-brake.
And then we got this thing down here.
After an adequate amount of banging our heads against the side of the car, I think we have a game plan. What we're going to opt to do is pull the axle out and access the bearing while the knuckle still sits in the car. To actually slide the axle out though, we have to remove this big bolt on the bottom of the knuckle and pull the hub off of the end here. Both of which might be a big pain in the butt, but we'll have to lube them up and see what happens when we go to try them with the impact or pry bar. After coating both the knuckles lower bolt that goes all the way through and the hub here, we'll have to wait for that to soak in before we can go at them and try and pull them off so that we can swing the knuckle out of the way, pull the axle out, and access the bearing. The first thing we wanted to accomplish was getting this hub slid off, and the best way to do that is with a slide hammer. But unfortunately, we don't have any attachments that would allow us to get it around the outside or bolt it up to get it actually well attached to the hub and get it slid off. So either we'll have to order a tool or make something. Either way, I think this is where we'll have to leave it and regroup, maybe buy some things, and look up what the best way to proceed is. The other thing is that on the inside, between the open air where the axle would go and the bearing, are a couple of seals that we don't have and did not come with our wheel bearing, and we also have to get those to put in after we remove the old ones to get the bearing out. While we're at it, we may want to look into getting a wheel bearing tool to get those bearings pressed in and out without taking the hub out of the car. And the nature of the Subaru wheel bearing, it's easier to just do it in if you have the right tool anyway. So like I said, I'll be back later with an update or to get back working on the car. It's been a couple of days and I'm finally ready to get back to work with this special piece. This will finally let me lock onto the studs with the slide hammer and pull that hub out. As you saw before, I did have a 3-pronged attachment for the slide hammer, but it didn't fit on my studs. This one slides right on, and now I can thread in the hammer and get this thing pulled off. Of course, not forgetting the included nut, which should prevent any damage to the threads or it loosening as I use it. And a few of my old acorns can be used to actually hold it in place so that I'm not scared of damaging my nice new black ones. Which means now I can give it a couple whacks and hopefully the hub pops off. You can now see my bearings, and the last step to actually getting this thing loose is getting rid of this massive bolt that goes through the rear of the knuckle and is most likely seized in more than one spot. With the car jacked up a little bit more and secured on both sides so it's even with jack stands, I'm under it so you can see now how badly this bolt has the potential to be stuck in, and I'm going to try and get the nut on the end of it off with the impact. The nut did come off, but now the hard part is actually getting that bolt out of the knuckle. After completely wailing on the end of this bolt with the impact gun, it hasn't budged at all, so I guess we're going to have to break out the air hammer and some more drastic means to get this thing loose. Turning the end to try and get it loose, we did snap off the end of the bolt, which isn't a terrible thing because we think that the other side is seized, so it might be easier to drive it through from this end. Using one of the skinnier tips on the air hammer, we might be able to just push it through or do a lot more than just bouncing off the end of the other side. With the bolt cut, the lower part of the knuckle is freed, and now we can get good access to the stuck part of the lower control arm. As is, we can pull the hub off enough to get the shaft out, but we still have to worry about the section of bolt that is stuck in this bushing. Our plan now is to get a socket on the end of the stub of bolt here so that it presses on the metal part of the bushing and doesn't just wreck it, while being able to get a C-clamp on the other side to force the bolt loose from the metal part of the bushing. Of course, to get the mushroomed end off, we have to cut off the end of the bolt. Trying to use the C-clamp wasn't exactly working for us. It just ended up bending whatever we tried to use or walking off. So I think what we're going to have to do is push the entire bushing out and replace it. But at least we can move on to actually working on the wheel bearing, the original problem that we were trying to fix. And to do that, we first have to remove these inner seals, and then it can be pressed out using a tool. Before that's done, there also is a snap ring that has to be unclipped, and then things can start sliding out. The tool that we're actually going to use to get the bearing out is kind of like a big bolt with an end and different cuffs that are supposed to pull the bearing through and then catch it. At the end here, we have one that's correctly sized to fit over and stop it from pulling through, but then we'll have to switch it out to actually pull the bearing all the way through. Because the cup that was supposed to work for the outside of the hub here wasn't the correct size, it just kept slipping down, and we didn't want it to get stuck on there, we opted to hammer through the rest of the bearing, which seems to have worked just fine. With the old bearing out, it looks disgusting, and it has way too much play and is crunchy, next to the brand new bearing, which looks perfect and is very smooth and ready to go in. With the way that we got the hub actually taken out, it pulled one of the inner races of the bearing out with it, so that also has to be removed before this gets slid on at the very end of replacing that bearing. We can actually work on getting the wheel bearing back in, and for that to happen, we have to get all the surfaces cleaned up and smooth. Then the actual wheel bearing can be pressed in place with that tool that we used earlier to slide it out. We know the bearing is bottomed out and the correct depth in because you can see that the rear edge of the snap ring groove lines up with the front of the bearing, which can then be installed back in its groove and made sure that it's properly seated before we can move on. Then the front side seal can be put in place to keep the thing nice and clean with help from one of these tools. Next, the hub can be cleaned up and installed because the tool that draws it into the housing may damage the seals on the back side of the bearing. Before the hub can be reinstalled, of course, if you took the ABS ring off, that must be reinstalled because it can only be done at this step in the process. Similarly to drawing in the bearing before, we're using the same tool with a different attachment to pull the hub into the bearing. Again, it's important to remember to take out the little plastic piece that came in the bearing. With the hub fully installed, now we can finally put on those seals that go on the back of the bearing and keep debris, dirt, water, whatever, out of the bearing and sealed.
They were disintegrating. Under your leg or something.
Where everything sits, we're somewhat stalled because that stub of bolt is still stuck in the bushing. But like I said, we'll have to get a new one and pop the whole thing out. In the meantime, we can try and get everything as clean as possible, degreasing, cleaning up any rust, and getting everything greased up so that hopefully, if this ever has to be done again, it'll be easier to get things apart with more anti-seize applied and any surface that needs to be smooth, absolutely smooth. It's been way longer than expected, but I'm finally back to finish up the CV axle job and the wheel bearing. Like I mentioned before, I was going to need this bushing to keep going because that stub of bolt is stuck in the metal sleeve of the one that's currently in the car. It took a little bit longer than expected, ordering it from our local parts store, but it finally arrived. The CV shaft, however, took way longer than expected, and we ended up having to go to a different parts store and canceling the order because they still have it lost somewhere in shipping. Either way, I got the parts and I can actually get this thing done. You may be wondering why I have a rear CV axle, because I only intended to replace that front passenger side one with the torn boot, and that's because upon closer inspection, the one in the car looks really bad. At first glance, it doesn't look terrible, but you'll see this rusty pitted surface, and that is exactly what goes on the backside seals of the wheel bearing. When we took the seal off, it did look a little bit more chewed up than normal, and I think that water had been getting into the old wheel bearing, making it go bad, and also leading to the degradation of the surface. And if I just throw this axle back in, I think it'll continue to chew up those backside seals and make the entire job not worth it. So, while I have everything apart, I figured I might as well go and get one. And I know people comment about the rustiness of this car, but all of the structural parts that matter for keeping the car safe and in one piece are sound. Things like these dust shields, which commonly rot out on cars around here, are not that important, and if I really need one, I can replace it. It's a minor thing that won't have to be dealt with in the big scheme of things. It's been a while since I had the camera out, so I'm not sure exactly where I left things, but the next step is getting that bushing pressed out of the control arm. Because it's difficult to get one of our clamps on there to get it pushed out, we're going to try and heat up the outer housing and then push the bushing through. I also have vice grips on that stub of bolts so I can start twisting it and moving it around to get it loosened up while it heats up and the rubber starts to fall apart. Finally, the bushing has let free from the housing and the malleable rubber can be slid out. That's all good and well, but before we can even consider putting the new one in, we have to get it cleaned up and get any of that excess rubber out so that the surface is smooth and clean for the new bushing to get installed. Okay, you hold the clamp.
Yeah, trying to.
The bushing looks like it's all set for the most part, and while one of the sides is a little bit ugly, the side you're looking at is firmly pressed against the side of the housing, and it seems like the metal sleeve inside is centered inside the housing.
Let's see if it's the same.
With the old CV taken out, we can now grease up the ends of the new one and get it popped in. Just like with that axle up front, it can be slid into place and then you have to pop it so that it fully engages before you can consider it installed. Just like the removal process, the knuckle and the hub attached to it needs to be pulled out of the way so that the greased up end of the axle can be slid in.
No more. All right.
As you can see, it's loose. But before we go, putting that big bolt back in, we have to clean up all of the metal surfaces that it's going to be coming in contact with, anti-seize, grease, whatever it takes to get them smooth and keep it from getting seized in the future. Of course, to get this reassembled, we got a new bolt and hardware to go along with it to get all that crusty stuff out before. Obviously, we can't reuse the bolt, but we don't want to reuse anything because it's rusty, and getting new stuff along with anti-seize and grease will help it not get seized in the future. With that fairly tricky process of getting the bolt actually fed through, I can now put on my new washer and the nut, draw it through, get that torque to spec, and then get things like the e-brake cable put back in the retainer and other things tidied up. The e-brake cable is back in its place, and that main bolt through the knuckle is all torqued down. So now we can start reassembling the e-brake stuff and get that nut on the end of the axle. Now any of that remaining plunge of the axle into the hub will be taken up as it's drawn through by this nut. And just like the front, this has to be torqued down to the specified value, which we have to go find. Leave things better than you found them is a pretty good principle to live by in your entire life, and even when working on cars. If you saw one of my original videos on this car, I replaced the brakes, and we did go about putting new e-brake shoes on, but we didn't replace all the little clips, springs, and other hardware in there. So we figured now, while we have it apart, we might as well get that done. Like with the front, a punch and a hammer must be used to dimple in that little spot on the nut so that it sits in the groove and keeps it from rotating off. If you want to see the process of getting the brakes done on this car, I do have another video of that on the channel, so go check it out. And otherwise, you've seen me change wheels and take brakes on and off enough times. So once again, it'll just get done. And just like that, it's back together. And just for a little sanity check, I'm going to get it down on the ground and take it for a ride before I get things cleaned up. Getting the car up to speed and letting the clutch in, I can only hear the road on the tires, and there's no longer that humming noise of the bad bearing. And I also want to say that check engine light you see is from a small evap leak, which I've yet to resolve. It keeps coming and going, and I keep checking it with the scanner. It has never been anything serious. This is all good news, so I'm going to take it for a fun little drive and then close this video out when I get back to the house. As you can tell, it is the next day when I'm filming this, but as you saw in the last couple of clips, all checks out with the car, and I'm happy I finally got that done after waiting to do it for so much time. The other cool thing about the drive last night and going to and from work today was that the car is finally at 500 miles, and you know what that means. I didn't even notice until I got home, but that 500 mile mark means I can drive the car however I want, and I can finally do an oil change, get some good oil in this thing, and do an all-around check to make sure everything's good. Since changing the oil isn't enough for a video, I'm finally going to be going over the cost associated with getting this stupid thing rebuilt and back on the road. I'm going to go over the parts I used and outline the process that I took in a little breakdown video. I also said that I was going to toss in clips for the wing installation at the end of this video, but after editing those clips together, it was enough for its own video, so you would have seen that already anyway, and I have no need to put it in now. Like I mentioned before, I still do have parts to put on this car that are a little bit cooler than getting things like a CV axle and wheel bearing done, so stay tuned for that installation video. And if you care about the cost breakdown of the engine rebuild, that will be coming, but if not, that'll be one to skip. Hopefully you are excited to see more progress on the car. Hopefully you enjoyed or got something out of this video, and if you did, I'd appreciate it if you liked, commented, or even subscribed to the channel. And for now, this is me signing off.